Today is April 10th at 7 p.m. We have Kathleen Apotnik and Masih giving us a poetry reading at the Flint Memorial Library in North Reading, Massachusetts.
Thank you for coming tonight. We have two poets with us. We have Kathleen Apotnik, who has out a book on lyric poetry, and she'll read from her collection Bright Realm, which was published in 2013 by Turing Point. And she's also has published two poetry books, Near the River's Edge and The Port. We have also Masih, who will read and discuss prose poems. And she's the author of a short story collection, Where the Dog Star Never Grows Old. She's also the editor of the Rose Medal Press Field Guide to Writing Flash Fiction. And I know Tara was here a couple of years ago during the workshop in Flash Fiction. And copies of the books will be available here and are certainly available at the library.
Thank you. I'm going to start, and thanks again for coming, and Helena for providing a place for writers and readers to come together. I'm going to divide my time into two parts, speaking about the lyric poem and reading from my book of lyrics. But before we begin, let's review categories of poetry. Narrative poetry that tells a story, such as a ballad like John Henry, or an epic poem like Homer's Iliad. Dramatic poetry, such as a verse play by Shakespeare, performed on a stage by actors. And lyric poetry, like odes, elegies, sonnets, and free verse. For the most part, lyrics are shorter than narrative poems or verse plays, and usually express thoughts and feelings of the speaker or the poet. As you probably know, the categories blur. Dramatic poetry, for instance, often contains lyrical interludes, and a series of lyrics, like my book of lyrics, can form a narrative when read together. It tells a story. All poetry has its origins in music associated with religious rituals, yet only lyric poetry retains music as its dominant element, the music created in the rhythmic patterns of the lines as they are structured and then spoken. Part of the word lyric comes from lyra, a Greek word that refers to the musical instruments like the lyre used to accompany ancient Greek poems as they were chanted or sung and sometimes danced. Since the Greeks modeled much of their poetry after Egyptian poetry, I'm going to just speak about 10 minutes on early Egyptian poetry, concentrating on the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom periods. Now, this talk is just a mere introduction. Naturally, I'm only going to spend a short time. And if you're really interested, I have my sources indicate where you might look for more information on more poetry by these early Egyptians. The most complete evidence of early lyric poetry comes from Egypt's Old Kingdom period, which ran from 2650 BC to 2135 BC. So it's a long time ago, around 4,000 years ago. And this comes in the form of pyramid texts. These texts are inscriptions carved on the walls of sarcophagus chambers and tombs. They are narrations, invocations, and incantations, often recited with the accompaniment of a musical instrument like the harp. Many were meant to ease the soul of the deceased king in its journey to heaven or the afterlife. Let's look at the English translation of one of these pyramid texts on the handout. The name Unas refers to King Unas, whose reign ended in 2345 BC, and Osiris refers to a god of the afterlife. According to scholars, these early Egyptian religious utterances probably had a form of free rhythm centered around accents on the units of meaning and did not have a rigid meter. I'll just read it as I imagine it was chanted, and maybe you can imagine the sounds of a harp playing behind me or something. O Unas, you have not gone dead. You have gone alive to sit on the throne of Osiris. Your scepter is in your hand that you may give orders to the living. The handle of your lotus-shaped scepter in your hand. Give orders to those of the mysterious sights, the dead. The lyrical elements come from the poetic devices like alliteration, repeating sounds on the line, the O's and the word you. You see them repeated over and over again. And something called parallelism, which is a state of correspondence between two elements in the poem, here between the clauses throughout, if you notice that. You have not gone dead, you have gone alive to sit on the throne of Osiris. Those two clauses almost speak to each other. And your scepter is in your hand so that you may give orders to the living, the handle of the throne of Osiris. Your scepter is in your hand so that you may give orders to the living, the handle of your lotus-shaped scepter in your hand. This parallelism creates a cadence, and along with the direct address, O Unas, heightens the emotion. So this parallelism you see in the Bible, in biblical literature, where the clauses repeat. There were many poetic forms on stone and papyrus by the Middle Kingdom period, about 2100 BC. In addition to funeral songs, which are elegies, songs of praise to the king, odes, invocation to the gods, hymns, and instructions from the king to his successor, which was kind of like an early information technology poetry, and epitaph autobiographies that attested to the deceased's virtues and moral worth as they traveled to the afterlife. There were dialogues, laments, proverbs, as well as private tomb inscriptions. These private tomb inscriptions include work songs that appear on stela or funerary monuments. These were not composed for ritual texts associated with a burial, so the author could use their imagination in writing about death. An English translation of a harper song from the Middle Kingdom period appears on the handout. And at the Middle Kingdom period begins about 2000, 2040. So these songs, again, weren't part of rituals. So there's a little more freedom of movement to say exactly what they wanted to say. From the harper's song from the tomb of King Intef. He is happy, this good prince. Death is a kindly fate. A generation passes, another stays, since the time of the ancestors. The early gods rest in their tombs. Blessed nobles, too, are in their tombs. Yet those who built the tombs, their places are gone. What has become of them? I have heard the words of Inhotepan and Hardadef, whose sayings are recited whole. What of their places? Their walls have crumbled. Their places are gone, as though they had never been. None come from there to tell of their state, to tell of their needs, or to calm our hearts until we go where they have gone. Hence rejoice in your hearts. Forgetfulness profits you. Put myrrh on your head, dress in fine linen, anoint yourself with oils fit for a god. Let your joys increase, let your heart not sink. Follow your heart and your happiness. Live your life on earth as your heart commands. When that day of mourning comes, the weary-hearted hears not their mourning. Wailing saves no man from the pit. Celebrate, do not weary of it. Lo, no one is allowed to take his goods with him. Lo, no one who departs comes back again. So that's quite a departure from the first one. So that's why I wanted to put that in, because the sentiment is important. It was a very stratified society that these people lived in. But this freedom from what was expected creates a song lamenting the passing of life, but urging the living to enjoy life while it lasted. Kind of carpe diem theme. Two other poems from this period that are not on the sheet are the dialogue of the despairing man with his soul and Hymn to the Nile. They're often cited as examples where the personal tone begins to play an important role. By Egypt's New Kingdom period, there is a flowering of the arts. Poetic forms include the songs of revelry, the epitaph, and the love poem. Among the many love poems is this excerpt of a tender lyric shown on the handout. I passed near his house. I found the door open. My friend remained beside his mother, all his brothers and sisters with him. They are taken with sympathy for him. All those who pass on the way, he looked at me when I passed. It's long and intimate, and it's as direct as a Louise Gluck poem. If you read a lot of poetry, you know her work. Alex Preminger, who's the editor of the Princeton's Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, speaks of its ebb and flow of impressions rather than external facts. So this personal kind of lyric will influence the Hebrews in writing the Song of Songs, which I found really interesting, that the people who come to write the Bible over a period of 1,000 years are influenced by this personal expression. The most well-known of ancient lyrics belong to the Hebrews' Old Testament, written over 1,000 years between the 10th and 9th century BC. One of the oldest lyrics is the Song of Deborah, about 10th century BC. A search online will take you to a link that lets you hear Laurence Olivier, the actor, read it on YouTube. It's really impressive, and I recommend that you do that if you're interested in hearing something really beautiful by a good actor. Long after the Song of Deborah come the hymns and the songs of David and Solomon's Song of Songs. The Hebrews improved lyrical techniques and used more figurative language, such as metaphors and similes, and created more poetic forms, such as the Psalms, which comes from the Greek psallion. Hebrew lyrics were accompanied by harp, sackbut, and cymbals. I'm not sure what anyone here know what sackbut is. It's a musical instrument.
Cow udder, maybe?
A what?
Cow udder?
A cow udder. I'm not sure.
I think they used to use cow udders.
Oh,
All
okay.
in the night. I don't know.
Okay,
Sounds like
we'll have to
it.
find out. We'll have to look that up. Okay, it's one thing I didn't do. The Hebrews composed other lyrical forms such as proverbs, epigrams, apocalyptic prophecies, and other wisdom literature, as well as lyrical dialogues or dramas in the Book of Job. The use of apostrophes and hyperbole increased the personal tone beyond that of the Egyptians. There are biblical references to how these were read and performed transformed in the story of David in Samuel 1 and 2. There is no consensus on the meter, but we see the use of alliteration and parallelism coming back. In Psalm 19, these are just 5 lines from Psalm 19. People here probably know the whole psalm, but and you see how the lyric advances here. The complexity of the lines. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where the voice is not heard. Their line has gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun. So again, even though it's advanced and complex, more complex, you get that cadence that got in the earliest ancient lyric there with the parallelism and the repetition of sounds. So in conclusion, or in summary, maybe I would just say in summary, that this early Egyptian poetry was religious, instructive, and respectful of authority, with a certain freedom of expression coming just before and during the Middle Kingdom period, and an impressive lyrical display, especially by the Hebrews in the New Kingdom period. Public mode used in ceremonies and performances, and private mode of the lyric established in Egypt will continue into ancient Greece, where the world will be blessed with, among other lyrical examples, the choral odes and the public poetry of Homer, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, and the personal lyrics of poets like Sappho. So that's just a little bit of what I found. I'm not a scholar of early Egyptian literature, but there are people who have done this, and again, they're listed on my sources. My book, Right Realm, which came out in the last fall, forms a kind of memoir of the journey my husband Tony and I continue to take with our adopted son, Michael, who came from Korea at the age of 2 to live with us in Andover in 1974. My mother also lived with us for a time, and she is the subject of a few of the poems. While the stresses brought on by what was determined to be Michael's developmental delay and a language disorder are addressed, there is a strong focus on the New England landscape, as well as the cultural landscape of art and history that often present metaphors and symbols for what is going on in our lives. Okay, so I'm going to just read some of these, and then Tara the first one here is called Bracelet. It's a poem addressed to my husband, who is here in spirit tonight. So, and also the bracelet on the poem is about. Bracelet. I've been looking at your gift, the narrow band I wear like a ring, with spherical C-knot clasp tracing the planet's orbits. Some might call it a bangle, something decorative, but it is more than silver or a reflection of the store's bright lights. Perhaps the gods smile favorably on the giver, bestowing on him a synchronicity with the heavens, a magical wonder in the giving. And if there are no gods, no heaven, whatever force binds the cosmos binds us now in the journeying its unknowable end. When our son Mike was young, we liked to take short trips on Saturday or Sunday to explore a particular city or town. Here in this poem addressed to my husband, we are in Chelsea at the site of the former Naval Hospital just before it became Admiralty Estates. There's a reference to two artists, Martin Johnson Heade and Fitzhugh Lane, and as you know, they painted Atlantic coastal scenes. A view from Admiral's Hill on our anniversary. We were in a car on a hill in Chelsea at the old Naval Hospital. The two of us with Mike at 9. Here, centuries of sailors and Marines waited to heal, stared out as we did at light dimming, seabirds rising over Sunday's harbor. A Norwegian oil tanker approached. We rode down to greet it, the car racing through snowy streets to find tugboats guiding it in. Turning a corner, we saw it loom like a whale heading right for us. I thought of ancient sea creatures facing predators, New Bedford whalers pursuing Melville's Leviathan, hounded for its blubber and oil, wanting revenge. Only the tanker's full stop calmed us, had us waving to a crewman, no one aware of the stranglehold the cargo would one day have on us. On the hill, the view was transformed. Sunset's palette, a rose and gold mist, much like Heade's oils of Newbury marshes, or Fitzhugh Lane's Gloucester and Salem, their calm seas and harbors. And we talked of what we saw and then of us, the lucky years, not just high points, but events gone wrong, the sad humor of it. Mike changed the tone, spoke of camping in Acadia, his stone-skipping win at Marsh Pond, bike rides on the carriage trails, feeding the gull that loved cheese. His laugh, we seldom hear it now. How deep it was for a boy so young. Cormorants like ebony statues perched on pilings that day. Their great wingspan surprised him as they lifted off. Could one carry me, he asked. Sure, you said, though you wouldn't know it. From this height, this distance, they're like us, mere specks. We lived in a house by a forest before moving to a house in a clearing, and this poem is about the effect of that move. Hill Song. After years at the edge of a wooded hill, I welcomed the new house in a sunlit field, its wide openness, its sky view. Still I flinched when the chimney-trapped hawk, your gloved hands freed, flew to its refuge, its nest on that hill. A hill once ours with its barn owl hooing and screeching jays, old grapevines thriving along abandoned rock walls not far from our small green cape, rooms where we loved and argued, worried over things that couldn't be fixed. All this lost now to snowfall and leaf-fall, the years of our raking and shoveling, summer bike rides by the northern white pines. Waiting. I watered the lawn. Overhead, a jet would pass, perhaps the one carrying you, gone so often now on company trips. And the farther it flew, the more it seemed a wisp, a kite launched with Mike from Plum Island's beach, those windy spring days. A plane's vapor stream recalled cigarette smoke spiraling from your desk. Proposals would do, deadlines loomed. I watered the lawn. You flew into the blue with briefcase and paperbacks. Conferences convened on mining, defense. Mornings we rose, you to check agendas with those I really met, I to edit texts, run errands with mother, gets Mike to speech. Summer heat pressed down on blades the hose didn't reach. Everything needed tending, waited like the yard for your caretaker's touch. When my son started school, I returned to teaching, working, traveling to look in on my mother, and getting Mike to speech therapy. Left me a little overwrought at times. This poem presents an antidote to that, or at least a way of putting things in perspective. Saved. Once in a classroom, the children and I looked out to see snow falling hard, and while I focused on the boughs nearly breaking with their burden, yet accepting of their fate, the children focused on the wider scene, snow coming down wildly, the fierce swirling of it. That place and time, that day was saved, entered into the archive I draw from when overwhelmed. The children's joy, the storm's power over us, the boughs waiting for relief, certain to come. Pearls for my mother. Your health in decline, you came to live with us, stayed in a room converted for your comfort. More care was needed, a nursing home found, a fate unimagined. Once visiting, I saw you reach for your pearls, lift them from the bureau as a shift in the brain made you freeze, Mum, the beads slip, each one breaking from the rest. Like us scattering over Erie Street, having pushed through enemy lines in childhood's Red Rover, restraining attackers, yet too tired to hold on, the chain of our locked arms severing in the effort. Here I'll read a section of a poem called Objects as Portraiture. What you need to know is that the word soul refers to Seoul, Korea, and she refers to the wife, he, the husband. A festive silk stringed bag on a sideboard, a token of their son's soul beginnings. Opposite on a window ledge, glazed miniature oriental lions facing each other. Behind them, a changing backdrop of sun or clouds, snow falling or rain pounding against the glass. They bought the lions for good luck after a crisis. Something about their son, he and a friend upsetting neighbors, and an embarrassment as she saw it, an isolated incident, one goading the other in the mischief, for him a foretelling. Ed Maudsley. We walked the paths of this former river estate, not with Mike on your shoulders, as in earlier years, but single file, alone in thought, faded to our separate ends. The ghost manners are raised, the burdened airs dispersed, folded documents of their past tucked neatly in worn luggage. Here, Jay's shriek, stay alive, where Whittier read to carriage-borne friends, stanzas shaping the past as idle, though rousing verses too against slavery's cruel oppression. The land assuages and traps us with its grand allure. Today, for instance, in its natural state, it seems a bonsai loosening, becoming what it was meant to be, like us in our middle years. Okay, I'll just read two more. This next one here is a dialogue, and as I was researching the lyric, I noticed that there were many dialogues in Egyptian and Greek poetry, and I was kind of surprised. Michael, our son, is doing well, pretty well now. He lives on his own and with some help, and sees us on the weekend and occasionally during the week. This poem takes the form of a dialogue that took place a number of years ago, so it's a different scene now, well, most of the time. It begins with a quote from the poet and critic Randall Jarrell. Scene in a coffee shop, the darkness from the darkness. Pain comes from the darkness, and we call it wisdom. It is pain. From the scene in a coffee shop, from the shop's window, she could see daylight fading, a car's low beams coming on in the plaza. He wasn't looking out, but toward her. Well, I don't want it. But it's your support, a kind of net to help you live on your own. I don't need it. But the trouble continues. I can solve my problems. It's as if we're running in a circle. Get me out of the circle. I want to be somewhere else. Moving won't change anything. You have to face your demons, find the causes. She might help you do that. I don't want to see her. A long silence. It's getting dark. I have to go. Do you want a ride? No. I'll walk back myself. Can I call you tonight? He didn't answer, just headed out, circling the plaza with its discount stores and fast food restaurants idling late in the day. She drove onto the highway, wondering if anything would change. And I will end with this spring poem. After this long winter, it seems appropriate to read a poem set in spring. It was inspired by the Portuguese poet Adélia Prado, who wrote a poem called St. Christopher Transit. And after I read it, I was inspired to read this poem, Bright Realm, for Adélia Prado. I don't want to leave this earth either, Adélia, planet of ridges and faults, downtowns and country parks, sweeping lawns, city traffic. News brings reports of arrogance, prejudice, unbearable horror, which I selfishly shut out at times, not to be overtaken by its spirit-killing power. After short trips with Tony, sometimes with Mike, we come back to the familiar, like Canada geese on the fly. Mike to his seaside city, us to the inland house and yard, the town's center and library quiet, children playing on the common with its memorials to the war dead. Back to the forest, its old rock walls signaling other families in time. In this bright realm, sometimes the light blinds Adélia. I think we never truly see or learn how best to care for one another. There are no mountain gods atop Greylock to our west, or Cannon to the north, no Atlantic sea god to advise our unreliable souls or bring back those we love. I see you notice nature's power to deflect the bullets, trick us with the season's beauty. Each day, just watching the dark come on fills me with wonder. Too soon the weeds intrude, assailing me with guilt and remorse. What will happen to us, to the headstrong ones around us who refuse assistance? I don't want to hurt or be hurt by what I do or fail to do, but it happens. Her head's in the clouds, my mother would tell my sister. She was right. I'm a cloud traveler, yet completely here, present and accounted for. Not wanting to miss this spring day, scent of new grass, wildflowers in the fields, where just last month snow spread its heavy mantle. Thank you. Thank you for listening. And now my good friend Tara will.
Well, thank you, Kathy. I learned a lot. It's sort of interesting. You're going to see some crossover here now, which is completely unintentional. She and I did not discuss this at all as to what the discussions were going to be. My portion is to introduce you a little bit, if you are not familiar with the turn to prose poetry. And I'm also not an expert by any means. I just sort of stumbled onto it myself. I used to write some poetry in the past. It wasn't very good. I definitely went more into the prose direction. And I'm more of an expert on what's known as flash fiction, which is, if you're not familiar with that term, very short fiction, short fiction. It can be a paragraph, it can be a page. And somehow, while I was writing this flash fiction, the poetry kind of crept into it. So even though I'd sort of abandoned the poetry and wasn't highly successful as a poet, still having practiced it and done it, average, still found its way into my prose. And I would start sending out what I thought was flash fiction to magazines, and sometimes the editor would come back and say, I really like this, but I think it's prose poetry. I'm going to publish it as prose poetry. So I heard that a few times, and I started thinking, what is prose poetry, and am I writing it? And so I looked into it a little bit and became more aware of it. It's definitely something that, in the same way that flash fiction is starting to be discussed and taught in classrooms, the prose poem is also finding its way into classrooms and academia. I've included here a couple of definitions of prose poetry, and I'm going to admit that I'm not crazy about the first one, simply because I don't understand it fully, but we're going to talk about it because it comes from someone who's very well respected in the field. It's Michael Benedict, The Prose Poem, an International Anthology. This is from his introduction, and a lot of prose poets quote him. And in it he asks, what are the properties of the prose poem today? And he lists 5 elements, and they are the unconscious. And I don't understand that because to me, the unconscious plays a role in all writing. 3 is a visionary thrust. 4 is a certain humor. I've read plenty of prose poetry that has no humor in it whatsoever, and in fact, the pieces I'm going to read don't. And a hopeful skepticism. I don't quite understand that myself. But number 2, the use of everyday speech, I think is definitely something I can relate to and understand. And going back to what, the history that Kathleen talked about, I think, all of our literature and our prose can be traced back to the Bible. And in the same way that she traced the poetry back to that point, we can kind of trace back the short story, the fable, even the prose poem. Basically, in some ways, the whole Bible is made up of many prose poems. The definition that I prefer, that I cobbled from a few different places, I can talk a little louder.
Sorry.
That's all right, I can talk louder. The definition I prefer is a composition written as prose in prose form, but having the concentrated, rhythmic, figurative language characteristic of poetry, including intensity, imagery, and compactness. And to me, the 2 things to really hang on to here are rhythmic. As Kathy mentioned a lot about the rhythm in her, in the poetry she discussed, and the parallelism and the alliteration. And I want to stress also compactness. This is prose compacted. And I also found the root, the English word prose is derived from the Latin prosa, which translates as straightforward. So I thought that was very interesting. And it also harkens back to Benedict's The Use of Everyday Speech, meaning the prose poem is more straightforward in essence than perhaps the lyric poem. I'm going to pass a book around. This is an anthology of prose poems. It's basically, it had a theme that we had to submit to, which is classifieds. So the forms in here sort of follow the classifieds that you find in the newspaper. But I want to pass it around so you can sort of visually flip through and see, basically, if this was just a plain prose poem anthology, you would still see the same sort of structure. And you'll see that most of it's paragraph form. Occasionally you see some line-by-line poems, bless you, but they still sort of read in sentence structure. A couple of lists, some people play around with list poems. But this is a very good, also if you're interested, if you are a writer and you want to submit, the Prose Poem Project is a very good online magazine. She's the one who published this. So I'm just going to pass it around while I'm talking. Another very good resource if you want to do more history than I'm going to go into and research is the Rose Metal Press Field Guide to Prose Poetry. That's a newer book, and that's being used in the classroom a lot. I pulled out an example here that we're going to read shortly by Charles Baudelaire. He's a French poet and critic who lived in 1821 to 1867. He's mostly known for being the author of Fleur de Mal, which translated means The Flowers of Evil, which he published in 1857. And he's basically considered sort of the father of prose poetry. Very experimental. He translated Edgar Allan Poe, so he was exposed to a lot of different kind of darker writing. And in fact, he's sort of also considered sort of the first urban poet because he wrote about the city and concentrated on vice, sensuality, sex, and death, and he was considered quite scandalous. In fact, he was prosecuted for creating an offense against public morals. And lucky for him, he was let go with a fine, and he could have been put in prison. Many writers came to his defense, including Victor Hugo. And Victor Hugo wrote to him, and I loved what he had to say. He said, "Your book shines and dazzles like stars." And to me, that was emblematic of what prose poetry is. Again, it harkens back to that compactness, like little stars. And his book is mixed with some verse poetry, but the example I have here is in paragraph form, so you can see really sort of the first time that someone was experimenting with prose in the poetic form. And I want you to also listen to some of the same things that Kathy was talking about in terms of rhythm, alliteration, repetition, parallelism. So this is called Be Drunk. You have to be always drunk. That's all there is to it. It's the only way. So as not to feel the horrible burden of time that breaks your back and bends you to the earth, you have to be continually drunk. But on what? Wine, poetry, or virtue, as you wish, but be drunk. And if sometimes on the steps of a palace or the green grass of a ditch, in the mournful solitude of your room, you wake again, drunkenness already diminishing or gone. Ask the wind, the wave, the star, the bird, the clock, everything that is flying, everything that is groaning, everything that is rolling, everything that is singing, everything that is speaking. Ask what time it is, and wind, wave, star, bird, clock will answer you. It is time to be drunk, so as not to be the martyred slaves of time. Be drunk, be continually drunk, on wine, on poetry, or on virtue, as you wish. So again, you hear the repetition again that she was talking about, the use of everything, and then rolling, singing, speaking. And I love that he drops out all the articles at one point, and it's just wind, wave, star, bird, clock. It really hammers home what he's talking about. But as you can see, this is all in paragraph form. And symbolism plays a very large part. I think that might be a little bit of what Benedict was talking about in terms of visionary thrust. So I'm going to read a couple of mine now. So we're going to go from the 1800s to 2009. And I had not read this Be Drunk poem until a few days ago. And after I read it, I went, oh my goodness. I had written this piece in 2009, and I was doing things in here that you're going to see are very similar to the piece that I just read. And this is one of the pieces that I mentioned in terms of, I wrote it thinking it was flash fiction. I wrote it as a piece of a short story, but obviously I used more poetic devices in here, and when I sent it to Night Train, which is a local magazine that also publishes prose poetry, the editor, Rusty Barnes, wrote back and said, yes, I'd like to publish this, but I'm putting it under prose poetry. And I said, well, why? I was curious why the change. And he said, well, when I'm reading something, a piece of prose, and I start paying more attention to the rhythm and the language of the piece, I put it under the prose poetry category. And that, to me, is the closest definition I've come in the past few years to really putting a nail on the head as to what prose poetry is. So if you find yourself reading, a short piece of prose and you're not really paying attention to the narration as much or the story, or it doesn't have one as much, obviously Be Drunk is not a story. It's more sort of like a call to action. So this is the laughing place. You need a place like this to go to, I tell her, like my sister and I had when we were young. It's called the laughing place. You cannot be in that place without laughing. No matter what is going on in your world, in that space, only laughter is allowed. You start in the spring, sowing morning glory seeds in a circle around the sticks you've erected to form a teepee. Part of the beauty is in not knowing what color the flowers will be, blue or pink or white, sometimes all three colors in one mad hybrid. As the shoots begin to grow under your care, you guide the new tendrils, thin, trusting little fingers that gradually curl into a baby's fist around each stake, till the vines climb, hand upon hand, to reach the top. By summer, you have a tent of morning glories. You leave a space for a door so you can enter in the morning, when the flowers are open to the sun, and everything that has been dormant in the winter, under your skin, keeping you from eating, making you quake, making your words stab, keeping you from tipping into the next place, has to be laughed away. You laugh your hard life into the blue and pink and white funnels, laughed with the vibrations of bees' wings underscoring your tragic symphony. So you see in there that I, unconsciously echoed some of the same, repetition. They talk about
Right.
the parallelism and the alliteration and stuff in there. So I found that interesting myself. The final piece I'm going to read is a little bit longer, and it's a newer piece. Sue heard me read this, but I guess there was a child in the audience making noise, so people would have trouble hearing it. So luckily, you're hearing it again.
No little kids, yeah.
You're going to hear in this one now. Again, I wrote this as flash fiction, but in reviewing it, I decided it's more of a prose poem. And this one has a little bit more narration than the other two do. But again, you're going to hear a lot of the same devices, and it's a little hard to follow. So I'll try to read it in such a way that you can follow what's going on, because it's a little bit more experimental. It's called Small Orbits. Moths, planets, summer nights, our front yard, gathering and waning light, circling each other tangentially, tagging, rumbling, shrieking. Yes, vulnerable shoulder blades, innocent bud wings to adulthood. Supper in our flat stomachs, Surgeon General recommended in those days. Triangle charts, starch-based, protein, vegetables. Those choked down greens, not tuna helper, not hungry man from TV, which friends spoon down. Circling, we on banana seats, plastic baskets with neon flowers. We must stay virgins, avoid the metal bar that will somehow ruin all. My sister, my orbiting partner planet. The rest of the neighborhood materializing just beyond the streetlight. Balls sailing in their own trajectory, round, oval, hard, soft, mildew-specked, glossy new around birthdays. Then climbing, reaching into, above, around, hanging, somersaulting, turning and twisting tube tire swing game of disorientation. The hoots, the hollers, the joy when fireflies throb, travel. Headlights wink past, tires swoosh, sound carrying between the silent flicker of mating paths, calls, wishes. Those vegetable jars from the dented aluminum garbage cans out back, green bean labels, holes poked into lids, a child-made constellation. But our neighborhood bully, his nose glowing, ripping apart beauty, having life for show, his destructive show, the fiery abdomen glowing at the end of his bully nose. I launch, propelled in my anger suit at this new evil. Grass rising to meet my back hard, clenched hands finding, making my face bleed and blue. My sister, warrior yell, mounting, kicking, tangled hair flowing like Medusa with the force of filial fury. She conquers. She actually conquers as no one else has conquered. And the one who doesn't belong flees home at escape velocity to his blue shingled facade. And who knows what that goes on behind it. My sister, glowing, we in her lamplight shadow, her lesson about the course of things. We all now orbit her elliptically. We respect, we love. I whisper through tears, because she can hear, not see me, as the lamplight has just burned out, as it does, as it inevitably should. So again, you can see I've used rhythm very heavily in here. And it's more, if you didn't see this, you could think perhaps that I had put this out in meter or verse line. And so I don't really know, I think it's a judgment call sometimes, whether or not you want to put this in a prose form or if you want to break it out into stanzas and lines and meters. I think it's up to the poet and how they want to tell the story and what makes them comfortable and how they want to, get it out there into the world. And the lines are very blurry sometimes between the three genres of the poetry, the prose poem, and flash fiction or short fiction. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste of the small differences.
Right.
So I'm done.
Nice.
If you have questions, you can ask us questions about anything.
I have an anecdote anyway. Baudelaire's poem is in an early album back in the early 70s by Liam Clancy and Tommy Macon, where Tommy Macon recites it in Carnegie Hall.
Wow.
And it's quite inspirational there because everybody gets a taste of it there.
That might be, these days now, that could very well be online as well.
I bet you can find it on
Yeah.
YouTube, yes.
You
And,
can read much better.
A comment I had, I wondered if you'd ever read the Randall Jarrell poem, Hurt Hawk.
Hurt Hawk. I know his poem, The Children. Hurt Hawk. No, I don't.
I
may
recall
have-
that from study many years ago, and that was one of my favorite poems for a while.
Yes, he was a wonderful poet and writer and critic of his time, and we don't have critics like that writing about our poetry. We have, there are some people out there, but he was really good and well respected, and also a good poet.
Yeah, Carol Guess, if anybody again wants to, look into this a little bit more, Carol Guess is known for prose poetry. She's one of the better ones.
Right.
They're writing like that.
As you read it and then talked about, how could I have set it up like a poem, a lot depends on how you want to read it, how you want those rhythms to go, and the pauses, and end stops, it makes a difference. When it's in a prose format, you can read it as a piece of prose. If it's more of a structured poem-like format, then you hear it differently. You hear it because the speaker or the poet is going to stop or pause at certain points. So I think that makes a difference if you did set it up. The other thing that happens when you set it up, you sometimes cut it, but I liked it. I liked the accumulation of words and things happening, and it gives it kind of a strong rhythm.
Yeah, that's right. To me, the difference between the two is it cares more about rhythm than other poetic conventions.
Right.
And it also, again, I guess, is the choice of the writer in terms of, I feel less inhibited writing prose poetry because I don't need to know too much about poetry. I don't need to have the conventions of line breaks and meter stanzas, whatever you need to know. I can just write straight prose. I can write it all in a paragraph and not worry, and just pay attention to, in my mind, the rhythm and the story. Whereas I personally feel poetry is more complicated, more complex, and there's more going on that you have to do. And so for someone who's, it's a nice transition to experiment with if you do have trouble writing poetry, or if you just want to try something different and feel a little freer.
That's right.
Free up yourself. And you can go back, you could, like I said, you can conceivably just write like a stream of consciousness prose poem, and then go back and, fit it more into a more conventional prose poem.
Before I came, I was reading a little bit about the history of the prose poem and discovered why the French were, the driving force to it at one point. Their poetry in the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, was very strict about the meter, and it was very rigid. A lot of people wrote in this Alexandrine forms, and you had to have so many syllables on a line, and it was very strict, and people got tired of doing that. The poets decided, let's try something new here.
Well, that's why he was so controversial, because he was one of the first that broke away from that convention. And I'd like to think that that's because he was exposed to a lot of international writers. I found when I was doing a history of flash fiction that the more inventive writers tended to be cross-cultural. They either lived in other countries for a time, which he had, or they at least came into contact with writers from other countries, and that sort of formed their, a little bit more experiment. They were more willing to experiment than people within their own countries. So they would bring back a different form or a different idea, and that sort of would help spread, a different way of writing. So, I'm sure Edgar Allan Poe had a little bit to do with his new vision too, which is interesting.
I found it really interesting that you aimed at one audience and your editor thought it was better.
Yeah.
Another. That's an old story. That happens a lot in literature. A lot of writers, I realize this because, well, anyway, I'm not going to get into the big story, but a lot of writers have written stuff trying to get published by the big publishers as adult fiction. One writer had a 36-year-old adult narrator, so really intended it as adult fiction. Most of the characters were young, and you got this reaction of this 36-year-old to the young people, and the editor said, we'll publish this, but we're going to publish it as young adult fiction. And at first the writer wrote that she was, taken back by this. You got to be kidding. But then, you've got to go along with the publishers. And,
Yeah, the writer in the end has the choice whether to go with it or not. And didn't matter to me where he put it. I was just glad it was published.
Sure.
And it made me look at, maybe she looked at the YA world more after that, whereas I started looking into, prose poetry a little bit more.
Sure.
You were going to say something?
I was going to ask you about the Iliad and how that plays out in poetic form, or because that is not in my mind how you would read it rhythmically, but it was coming straight out of the Greek culture that had a lot of music in its language. Let's put it that way.
That's right. They did write it in a certain meter. The meter was a classical meter. I think there were like six measures in a line. There was a form that he wrote it in, and people kept to that form in writing other narrative poetry, poetry like that. But yes, no, there was a form that we followed. And then he wrote in like the 9th or 8th century BC. And then in the 7th century BC, because I had to look at this, someone put together a collection called the Homeric Hymns. And they were first attributed to Homer, but they weren't by Homer. They were by various people who were paying tribute to Homer by writing in the same meter that Homer wrote in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Homeric hymns, and I put one of them on the sheet on the back. I put a little bit of Greek, ancient Greek poetry on the back, and one of them is one of those Homeric hymns. That was the form they used in narrative poetry. His poetry was very public, and as opposed to like Sappho, who wrote very short lyrics, although a lot of her work was lost, so we only have fragments of what she wrote. But she was supposed to be his equal, but again, we only have a little bit of what she did. But, yeah.
How long have you been writing poetry?
Well, I wrote my first poems when I was in high school. I wrote a few poems, and then I didn't write until my late 20s. A lot of people seem to begin to write in their late 20s, early 30s, and that's where I started writing poetry. But I didn't publish for many years. And then I wrote, and I got into a writing program, which really advanced my writing, I feel. And then I published a couple of chapbooks.